Welcome to this series of short presentations that describe a practical approach to managing risk. This is module 4 of the series, and here we describe how organisations and individuals should go about discovering risk. In ISO 31000, this is called risk identification. The purpose of risk identification is to think of those risks which we might use to characterise risk. You recall in Module 1 we said that risks are hypothetical examples, scenarios that we propose to use to characterise risk itself, the effect of uncertainty on objectives. So the first challenge we face when we discover risk is to actually describe a risk. Normally we describe a risk in terms of this scenario, the thing that might happen or might occur or might already be present that leads to an effect, particularly an effect which is relevant in terms of our objectives. If things happen that lead to effects which have no real implication for our objectives, then they're not risks. It's only those things which have effects that materially affect our objectives which we should consider as risk, and therefore we need to understand. So generally we describe risk in terms of the thing that might happen and what it might lead to. We can also describe risk in terms of two further pieces of information: what might cause that thing to happen, and what are the existing controls that we believe are in place. You remember that controls are things which are actually modifying risk now. You'll see here that those four pieces of information, the thing that happens or occurs, what it leads to in terms of the effect on objectives, the causes of the thing that might happen, and the existing controls, are ideally the first four columns or piece of information that you store in your risk register. The other important consideration with describing risk is to make sure that the description is coherent and understandable by everyone. We need to use descriptions which are full. Don't use acronyms, don't use shorthand, so that anyone reading the risk register or the description of the risk understands fully the points we are making. Here's an example. Delays in implementing and phasing changes to timetables leads to customer complaints and drops in patronage. This risk is for a public transport operator. This is caused by competing demands for management time and controlled in part by integrated planning and communication processes. As you will see, that's a fairly full description. One of the challenges we face, of course, is if we use software to contain our risk information, often that software will not permit us to put lots of words in for each field. We are limited to the number of characters for each field, and that of necessity limits the ability to communicate about risks. We can play a test here, and you can also look at these and think whether what we have here are good or bad risk descriptions. I should mention that all the risk descriptions given here have been taken from real risk registers. This is a very common risk in project risk assessment. The project is over budget. And you see that this isn't a good risk description because all it does is describe the effect on the budget. It doesn't even describe the effect on the organisation's objectives. We failed to manage contractors and leads to project delays. This could be a good project description, project risk description, if project delays are material for the organisation. PDT stops. So often we use acronyms and short form in our risk registers. In this case, PDT refers to a component in a train, but you wouldn't know that, and neither would I some time after I'd written this description. It's also only the thing that happens and not what it leads to. Improved system reliability creates a revenue surplus. This is a good risk description. Someone's injured. Unfortunately, this is not a good risk description, but it's often found in organisations' risk registers. This is my all-time favourite risk, but not because it's a good description, but because it's pretty dreadful. The project fails. Fraud is an interesting risk description because really it's not a consequence or it's not even an event. It is merely some perceived effect from the event on the organisation. And whether the fraud is material or not really is a question of significance and also the organisation's objectives. So fraud is really not a good risk description. Indeed, it's not even a form of risk. This is a good risk description. Something is delivered late and that causes project delay. Similarly, a critical team member leaves taking an IP to a competitor. A security threat is probably a risk source. It's not a risk description. It certainly doesn't fit into the pattern of something occurring leading to. It's something which is already present. Effective performance reviews improve staff retention. That's a good risk description. And then finally, loss of confidence in the management team. This is really not that good. It could be that loss of confidence in the management team then leads to something, or it could be that something happens that leads to loss of confidence in the management team. But on its own, it is not a good risk description. There are many different methodologies for discovering risk. But whichever the approach we consider, they all have the same basic requirements. First of all, that they involve collectively a group of stakeholders in some form of structured discussion. Secondly, that there's some system behind the process that ensures that we are comprehensive and reliable and repeatable. Thirdly, that we characterize risk by these examples of things that happen and their effect on objectives. The fourth requirement is not always obvious, and that is that the approach is well recorded. A lot of emphasis is placed on the facilitation of these discussions, but as you might imagine, unless the discussion and its outcomes are well recorded, ostensibly we've wasted our time, and particularly we've wasted the time of stakeholders. So whoever records the conversation has an important part to play as the person who facilitates the conversation. A very common approach that is employed to risk discovery is to use brainstorming to hold the conversation. This is an iterative process. It's interactive, involving members of the team sparking off of one another, and it's team-based. Brainstorming has clear objectives, and these should be laid out at the beginning of the session, and generally the structure is provided by a key element system that we discussed in the previous module. There are some clear rules that have to be applied to make sure that brainstorming is effective. And generally, having a facilitator produces a very good outcome. It is important that participants for the exercise are carefully selected, and generally seniority isn't a condition for entry. It really is that the people concerned have an understanding of the subject matter and a degree of ownership of the outcome of the conversation. Generally, brainstorming works very well if the people who attend the session are well briefed and have had time to consider the subject matter beforehand. And that's why in the previous module we talked about the preparation of a briefing note. The final thing about brainstorming is that it's important to document the outcomes very clearly, because sometimes the conversation can get awfully muddled and people can get lost. So it's very important that we retain a coherent record of what was discussed and what was agreed. Generally, organisations use these devices called risk registers to record information about risks. But look, despite the perception that they have magic properties, they are just records of the discussions we held at some point in time. And quite frankly, last year's risk register has little meaning for next year's decisions. They are purely creating an audit trail that shows that we've gone through a process of discovering and understanding risk, which has then led to some conclusions about the acceptability of risk and what further actions are required to modify risk. So really they're just a means to an end. More importantly is that the company retains the context statements we talked about in the previous module and the risk modification or risk treatment plans which arise in the subsequent module. If we look at a risk register, it is important that the information we collect in it is really useful and usable. And quite frankly, organisations generate much too much information in their risk registers, much of which is never ever used again. The test has to be, could a normal person sit down and read across the page in a risk register and understand it clearly? And really this requires just a few columns and some fairly full descriptions where we avoid jargon or acronyms. We've all got into the habit of using spreadsheets as risk registers, but we should recognise their limitations. Firstly, the narrowness of the column makes it extremely difficult to write and read material. And secondly, certainly with Excel, there are limitations as to the number of characters you can store in a cell. While it might be attractive to use the spreadsheet for subsequent manipulation and sorting, there are some significant limitations in terms of storing data and information in a spreadsheet. It might be better that we actually just store material in a Word document and then transfer that into some database for further manipulation. Some of my clients, I must admit, have many tens of fields in their risk register, and you do suspect that a lot of the information generated is not used any further. We believe that there are really only 10 pieces of information you need to store in your risk register. The first is a unique number for the risk. The second, the description of what could happen, and then what it could lead to, and then what caused it, and the existing controls. The rest of the risk register is taken up with the outcomes of the risk analysis process where we understand the risk. Some think that indicates the effectiveness of the existing controls, then the chosen level of consequences, the corresponding level of likelihood for those consequences, and from that a level of risk. The final piece of information that we'll discuss later in this course is something called the potential maximum consequences or potential exposure. There is always a temptation for the conversation in a risk discovery and understanding workshop to lead to risk modification. It's inevitable that people will move on to the solution before they properly define the problem. And invariably people will offer opinions within the discussion or workshop as to how the risk should be modified. Let's not throw these suggestions away, let's record them, but I think we should recognise that these off-the-cuff views actually disturb the brainstorming process and distract the meeting from discovering and understanding risks. If you think about it, discovering risk is a right brain activity requiring intuitive, thoughtful and subjective types of thinking. Whereas risk modification requires more imagination. It requires less imagination, it's more sort of logical, analytical and objective. It really is a case of things dropping into place based on proper discovery and understanding of the risks. Our advice is not to consider risk modification, risk treatment if you will, within the risk assessment workshop, but to do that on another occasion. Particularly to do risk modification in terms of a series of small meetings held with risk owners. At those meetings can be the facilitator, the risk owner, together with any other specialists who might need to be present to examine potential risk modification options. So what are our practical tips and tricks for discovering risks? First of all, and I think we've all learnt this the hard way, you shouldn't try and facilitate and record the discussion at the same time. It's actually almost impossible to control the conversation, to steer it in the right direction, and at the same time concentrate on recording what is being discussed. It is always good practice to start with some general method of discovering risks, for example, the brainstorming method we talked about here, and then use more detailed methods for specific risks that require more rigorous treatment. For example, the risks may be particularly complex or at a very high level. In the last module, we showed you how to generate a key element system, and you should always follow this and in fact use that as the agenda for the discussion on risk discovery. It is almost impossible to produce a coherent, balanced and comprehensive set of risks through a series of interviews. You do need the people in the same room discussing these matters to remove bias and also to branch from one another and build their understanding of the risks. So always have a facilitated discussion. Some of us like to use projectors to project what is being recorded at that moment in time. But you have to be very careful. Unless you know exactly what you're doing, the projected text will slow down the brainstorming and you'll end up with people wordsmithing what is written there rather than exercising their imagination about risks. They will be drawn to the screen and will spend all their time arguing over the words rather than expressing their views on the risks. So we must be very careful the way we use projectors. The other thing that often happens is if you have somebody who's relatively unskilled typing up the risk register, then we're very nervous typing when other people are watching. It's sometimes better to record the outcomes of the risk assessment workshop on a laptop and then review them after the workshop for coherency, spelling mistakes and so on. So in this module we'd learnt that the foundation for good risk identification, for good risk discovery, is a good key element structure. We should always describe risks in terms of what could happen and what it could lead to, particularly if what it could lead to has an effect on our objectives. Brainstorming, providing that we have a key element system to structure it, is a good way to start discovering risks. And whatever method we use, we should always retain a good comprehensive record.